Okay, and then we'll get started. So again, yeah, welcome everyone to our January Twin Ports Climate Conversation. This month we'll be hearing from Kristen Schmitt with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, Thomas Prestby with Audubon Great Lakes, and David Grandmaison with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And they will be talking about a menu of adaptation strategies that they've been working on to help coastal managers plan for climate change. And then also a local example of how this menu is being applied in Allouez Bay. So really excited to have you all here. And I just wanted to thank the individuals and groups that are involved in supporting our climate conversations. So that includes Minnesota Sea Grant, Wisconsin Sea Grant, NIAX, the 1854 Treaty Authority, and Minnesota DNR and NOAA OCM. And just as a reminder for everyone, the goals of the Twin Ports Climate Conversations are to aid in improving climate communication skills for all, improving climate change related data collection and sharing, motivating and supporting community-based adaptation, increasing climate change conversation in more sectors and broadening the impact of those conversations, and then also talking about climate justice. And so again, we invite everybody to if you missed any talks, to visit the Minnesota Sea Grant website that has a link to previous recordings and examples of our conversations, and then also the ability to watch past recordings. So we'll also be posting this recording on the website as soon as it's ready. So again, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so Kristen, I'll turn it over to you. I'll stop sharing and take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks to everyone for coming today. I'm really excited to be here for the first Twin Ports Climate Conversation of the year of 2022. I'm really excited about this presentation today, where we are going to be talking to you a little bit about helping coastal ecosystems adapt to climate change. And Natalie introduced our talk really well and what we want to focus on. As the title might imply here, we're really going to focus today on natural ecosystems, natural resources, and not kind of the breadth of different coastal communities and infrastructures that might be affected by climate change. So we are focusing in a little bit on that natural resources piece. Okay, I can advance slides, great. So just a quick outline overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about some of the adaptation tools that we've been developing along with a whole host of collaborators to think about, how do we help Great Lakes coastal ecosystems adapt to climate change? What are those adaptation strategies and approaches that we can employ on the ground? And then I'm hoping to get out of the way and kick it over to my co-presenters to talk about that local example that Natalie mentioned. So thinking about Allouez Bay and some of the work that's going on there, and how to make that climate adaptive, how to incorporate climate considerations into that work that's being done there. And Natalie was kind enough to introduce us, but just so you know who our three presenters are today. Again, my name's Kristen Schmitt with NIAX. Just a little bit more about our group. One of my coworkers really likes to describe NIAX as a bit of a phone a friend desk for climate change. So our focus is really on how do we help natural resource managers, natural resources professionals consider science-based climate change information in their work and a lot of their management actions. So that's really our niche. And maybe I will kick it over to Dave and Tom to introduce themselves briefly as we get started here.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Dave Grandmaison. I am with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, work out of the Superior office, and I am working on a couple of different habitat restoration projects in the St. Louis River estuary, particularly this Allouez Bay project, which is very exciting, and marsh bird habitat restoration, which we'll get into, and then also working on wild rice restoration in the estuary with a variety of great partners. So thanks for having us today.
And I'm Tom Prestby with Audubon Great Lakes. I am the Wisconsin Conservation Manager. I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. and I manage a few projects with Great Lakes Audubon in Wisconsin, one of them being the Allouez Bay and St. Louis River estuary monitoring and restoration work that we'll be talking about some today. So yeah, as Kristen and Dave said, thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to telling you about our project today.
Thanks so much, Dave and Tom. I lost my cursor for a second there. So just to kick us off, you know, we're not going to go too deeply into what are those climate change impacts that we're seeing on Great Lakes coast. This is obviously really important. We've had past talks in the Twin Ports Climate Conversation series that have dealt with this more, but it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But I do think it's just important to start with a common understanding of what are some of those direct and indirect climate change impacts that we're seeing in our Great Lakes coastal ecosystems, and that we're expecting to see continue into the future. So this is a little bit of a laundry list here of both those direct and indirect impacts. But, you know, as you can see, this ranges from warmer air and water temperatures to changing precipitation patterns in the region, including increasing extreme events, extreme storm events, for example, changing water levels. So I think anyone who lives near or spends time near Great Lakes coasts has probably seen in the last couple decades these changes we've had between low lows and high highs, and how rapidly those changes are occurring compared to in the past. And we're also dealing with things like increased nutrient loading and increased erosion. And many of these patterns, as I mentioned, are expected to continue into the future. So the link below, and maybe Natalie can help me by pasting this into the chat as well, provides a really great overview on a lot of these changes from Dr. Madeline McGee. And a lot of this is summarizing information that's in a upcoming wiki, Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts report that focuses on coastal ecosystems. So that talk I recommend is a great way to get a well laid out overview of some of these climate impacts that we're expecting. So for our work, for the adaptation portion of this, one of the key questions that we're trying to ask is, given all of these climate changes that we're expecting, that we're experiencing now, how do we select management actions that are going to help those coastal ecosystems adapt to climate changes? You know, what should we be continuing as natural resources managers, or what should we be doing slightly differently? And that's really what the adaptation menu is set out to address. The format that we have for compiling a lot of this information, we call an adaptation menu. Here, I just want to point out that the adaptation menu, this is not a new format necessarily. Our group, NIAX, has written adaptation menus for other focus areas, other natural resources areas in the past. We started out kind of in the forests and urban forests realm and have expanded to work with partners on additional menus that are focused on other natural resources areas. One of the more recent ones being Great Lakes coastal ecosystems. And you can find out a little bit more about the menu and see a draft version of that at the URL below. So when we talk about an adaptation menu, what is that exactly? So it's really kind of what you might think of a menu being in general, right? An adaptation menu is a collection of possible adaptation actions, and a natural resources professional, a user, can pick and choose from those actions based on what works for their management project. So, you know, you're not going to sit down and order everything on a menu. You're going to pick and choose based on what works for you at the time. And the adaptation menu works in a very similar way. And fundamentally, it's really just a way to actively integrate climate change into coastal management planning. You know, we want to recognize that a lot of what people are doing already may make a lot of sense in terms of climate change. And this is just, the menu provides a way to really make those ideas explicit and create those links to some of the climate impacts that we're seeing. And then finally, we hope that the menu provides a way to connect broad adaptation ideas with really specific on-the-ground actions. And this is something we've seen a lot working in the management space, is just that, when you look through the adaptation literature, you see adaptation actions at all different scales, from really, really broad ideas to really specific. And so with the menu, we're really hoping to organize those in a way that makes sense and kind of leads you through broad to more specific, to really connect the dots for people on, what we're trying to do on the landscape to help adapt to climate change. It may also be helpful just to define really quickly what is not included in the menu. So as I hinted at before, the menu is not an assessment of climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. There's great information out there outlining some of those impacts and vulnerabilities to Great Lakes systems. And that's definitely something that can be used along with the menu. And the menu is not a list of recommendations. No one is going to sit down and implement every action on that menu. It's going to depend on the project that you're working on. I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who have worked on this menu. This slide includes some of them, or some of the organizations that are involved. NIAX, we acted as the conveners of this, but the work was supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program and Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and involved authors and experts from a number of different organizations that both helped create the menu and provided feedback. And this slide doesn't include some of the management projects that helped us test the menu, like Allouez Bay, which you'll hear from in a little bit. So what exactly is in the menu? We are getting to that. Kind of roughly, we organize the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches along the lines of these three main adaptation ideas or options: resistance, resilience, and transition. So this is just a way that we have of thinking about adaptation ideas and organizing those adaptation ideas at NIAX. And in a lot of other organizations and circles as well. So fundamentally, these ideas exist along a continuum. On the resistance spectrum, we might be thinking about adaptation ideas that help us maintain a coastal ecosystem the way it is. So similar species composition, similar locations of things, maintain that ecosystem as still recognizable with the same character. On the other end of the spectrum, the transition end, we might be thinking about adaptation ideas that alter the character of that ecosystem, but in a way that might be more in line with future climate considerations. So, there are legitimate adaptation ideas that cover this entire spectrum, and the ones that people choose are going to depend a little bit on where they're working in their project. So on the resistance end, we might be thinking about something like protecting a shoreline from increased wave action. And that might be through shoreline hardening, or it might be through soft measures, but ultimately we want to keep that coastal ecosystem intact and keep those waves from affecting it. On the transition end, maybe we're thinking more about moving infrastructure or allowing plants to move in response to that increased wave action. So in that case, we're not necessarily trying to keep waves out, but we're trying to respond to increased wave action by changing maybe the location of important infrastructure that we have there, for example. I know this slide is a lot to take in, but I thought it was important to show the 6 main strategies that ended up coming out in this menu as kind of these main broad categories of strategies here. And again, these are roughly kind of along this resistance to transition spectrum. So we have everything from, at the top, maintaining and enhancing fundamental hydrologic processes and sediment dynamics, to more transition-oriented ideas that might involve, adjusting plant species composition and actively managing transformation of a coastal ecosystem. And in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to dive into a few more specific examples here. So under that first strategy that I mentioned, that kind of broad category, of maintaining fundamental hydrologic processes and sediment dynamics. A more specific approach within that might be to maintain and restore natural sediment transport processes. And within that, you can probably think of a number of different actions or specific tactics that would support that approach. So for example, you might want to identify sources of sediment that support beaches or support bar systems in the area, and protect those sediment sources, keep them undeveloped, keep them able to supply sediment into the future. So that might be an action that falls under this approach. To illustrate another example, this is more of a transition type strategy, but here we're thinking about, okay, how can we actually adjust coastal ecosystems to cope with changes in hydrology or increasing storm events and erosion? And in this case, one of the approaches might be to maintain and create conditions for plants and animals to move along that inland to waterward continuum. And again, you can probably think of a lot of actions that might fall underneath this category. So maybe to make sure that wetland plants can colonize areas further inland, you have to do some invasive species control. This photo is showing a stand of Phragmites. So maybe you need to do some Phragmites control to allow plants to respond to changes in water levels. So those are both examples of how you kind of can step down through these broad ideas on the menu to specific actions. That's another example, but I'm going to skip that for now in the interest of time. Just a brief note on how we use these menus. So, the menus aren't necessarily meant to be used in a vacuum. They can be a part of a broader decision-making process. That also includes information about climate change vulnerability, studies that have occurred in the area to help us understand specific patterns about what's going on. And in the Allouez Bay example, you'll see a variety of information that that project group has collected and used to help inform their project. Where the menu can come in is to help fill that niche of thinking about, what are those climate adaptive actions that we can take that still help us meet the overall goals and objectives of a project and help us cope with some of the climate risks that we're seeing. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is get a lot of examples of climate adaptive action on the ground. The map that you're seeing here are examples of projects that have used that decision-making cycle, the adaptation workbook, as well as other menus, not the coastal menu, but other climate change adaptation menus to think about how to respond to climate change in their projects. And so a lot of these dots, you can go to this URL, you can click on one and read more about these projects. And we're hoping to have many of these dots that focus on Great Lakes coastal ecosystems as well in the coming years. So finally, how is this actually being applied? A really important part to creating the menu is testing it and testing it with people who are working on coastal management projects. And we were able to do that a few times with this Great Lakes coastal menu. In addition to Allouez Bay, which you'll hear from in a little bit, we also worked with a group in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and a group kind of down near southern Michigan on Lake St. Clair that was focused on Ford Cove area and a shoreline restoration project there. So each one of these provides an example of how the menu can be used, and each one of them are actually pretty different types of projects. So it's interesting to see how adaptation ideas get applied in these different contexts here. And finally, although we're not going to talk about Ford Cove and the Apostle Islands, there are links that describe a little bit more about each of these projects, and you're welcome to visit those after this presentation if you want a little more information on that. So without further ado, hopefully that gave a little bit of background about what we're trying to do, and I will kick it over to Dave and Tom.
Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate that intro. And a lot of important thought has really gone into the menu and how it is used. We were lucky enough as having a project here in the Twin Ports with Allouez Bay to test it and to utilize that knowledge. There's a lot of strategic planning going on with Wisconsin DNR right now in terms of resiliency to climate change impacts. I do want to make a plug for the video that Kristen mentioned that was put together by Madeline McGee. Fantastic overview of a variety of different impacts and opportunities and challenges. But Tom and I are we have, I guess, the pleasure of being able to talk about a project that we're working on with a variety of folks who I'll mention in a minute, that puts this planning process into action and has really helped to guide the development of some of the goals and approaches that we'll be using in Allouez Bay to restore marsh bird habitat. And Tom is going to talk a little bit more about those specifics relative to the design and the scope of the project. But I want to give a brief sort of background on the project itself. So Kristen, if you could advance to the next slide, please. And also, I should mention that this project is being made possible through funding through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And a variety of folks are lending their expertise and their knowledge on to this project. Folks from DNR, myself, and others who have been intimately involved in the topic of resiliency and habitat restoration in this area for years. Audubon Great Lakes, who is helping to co-lead the project and has a vast expertise in avian ecology and conservation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We've got folks from NRRI involved who are helping to monitor some of the bird populations within Allouez Bay and beyond. I think Tom will get into a little bit about that. Minnesota Land Trust has a landscape conservation design process that's ongoing and has focused on sort of a broad vision for restoration across the estuary, including specific sessions on Allouez Bay. The city of Superior and Douglas County have been strong partners in this, the planning processes and previous projects that have been going on in Allouez Bay, and the knowledge, the habitat management, restoration experiences brought to the table from Fond du Lac, Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, have been, especially as it pertains to the wild rice restoration work, has been instrumental. Lake Superior Research Institute has been doing research in Allouez Bay on wild rice and habitat restoration, and has been working with Wisconsin DNR on invasive species management for some time. And Allouez Bay is a date-regulated rice water. The St. Croix Chippewa Indians are involved as well in the wild rice aspects of restoration there. And then it was wonderful to bring Kristen and her team in from NIAX to help us sort of move the project forward under the lens of climate resiliency. So thanks to all these people for contributing their knowledge. Next slide, please. So marsh birds provide a very suitable system. The communities provide a system for monitoring the conditions of wetlands, coastal wetlands in particular in this case. And they are sensitive to disturbance, which allows us to look at how they might respond to management actions. Some of those responses are quite predictable. And so when Tom will talk a little bit more about specific habitat requirements, but the point here is that marsh birds and monitoring of these communities allows us to have a metric to gauge the success that we have in creating suitable habitat and restoring areas that may have been degraded for a variety of different reasons, which I'll get into. We also have techniques, very effective techniques to monitor these systems. So the selection of marsh birds and the focal species that have been selected, which include American bittern, least bittern, marsh wren, sedge wren, Pipebill Grieb, Sora, swamp sparrow, Virginia rail, and yellow-headed blackbird. These will help to guide and inform the success of our efforts in this particular Allouez Bay restoration site. Next slide, please. So it's probably not going to come as a big surprise to the folks that are on this call, but many marsh bird populations within the Great Lakes Basin are experiencing population declines, and a lot of the decline that we've witnessed with marsh birds has been sort of linked to the loss of coastal wetland habitat. There are estimates of marsh bird populations declining from 60 to 80%. And so this is a concern. They are a priority of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 3. And so luckily we've got funding available to take action. There's been a lot of focus on Allouez Bay in terms of the idea that it could be a test for the resiliency menu. And so that was moved forward by folks like Nat Miller from Great Lakes Audubon and Sheree Hagan from Wisconsin DNR really kind of pulled together this group of people that I mentioned and helped connect us to Kristen and her team to really move forward with the resiliency assessment. And next slide, please, Kristen. Thank you. A group of folks, sort of this broader process came together to develop a spatial prioritization tool through the leadership of Audubon. And what it did is it took coastal wetland monitoring data and evaluated habitat suitability across the Great Lakes, looking at habitat condition and developing a model that identifies and helps to prioritize strategic investments in restoration and conservation. So as part of that, the St. Louis River, which provides significant habitat for both breeding birds as well as migratory stopover habitat, came up to the top of the list, so to speak, in terms of a priority for conservation and monitoring. And so that helped to sort of lend some importance to the effort that would later develop into a habitat restoration plan. Wisconsin Point and Allouez Bay, of course, identified as important bird areas. And so these designations helped to drive this project forward. And I should mention, I put the header for this paper that was published. The group that put together the spatial prioritization tool published recently in Biological Conservation, and you can access the web interface for this tool as well. And I'll get that link to, unless Tom can drop it in the chat, I'll get that link to Kristen and you can share it if you'd like. It's really a great tool. You can forward to the next slide, please. So I'm sure most, if not everybody watching today has seen the maps here on the left, the herding map. We can make a quick reference to sort of historical conditions for Allouez Bay, sort of zooming in now a little bit more. And we can see that, you know, in 1860s, there was, based on the mapping that's provided on the left, a considerable amount, extent of emergent marsh habitat compared to what we see today. And in talking to folks, even as recently as the 70s and 80s, there was a considerable amount of emergent marsh habitat beyond what we see in the footprint of that marsh in the southeast end of Allouez Bay. So I don't have cursor control, but that southeast end, you can see where Bear Creek is, sort of east to Wisconsin Point Road. That complex of wetlands is where we're really focusing our effort, and with the goals of creating conditions that allow for the establishment and sort of fluctuation in Hemi Marsh, so that sort of juxtaposition of open water and emergent marsh vegetation that's really important for marsh birds, and Tom will talk more about that. But there's potential here for a lot of work to be done in terms of expanding the current footprint of suitable habitat for marsh birds. And Kristen, you can forward to the next slide. The potential here is great. There's a lot of previous and ongoing work that has been done. So there has been a considerable amount of work, as I mentioned earlier, on restoring habitat for wild rice and examining the impact of invasive cattail removal on the, what kind of a seed bank is there in the sediment that allows for recolonization by high quality native species. There has been control efforts for loosestrife and other invasive species. So there's ongoing work. There have been investments made here in Allouez Bay to restore habitat, and there is a known historic and contemporary importance of this habitat for breeding marsh birds. Water levels have played a role. We're at a sort of a historic high water level that is indications show that it's coming down. This provides us with some opportunities to do some work to increase resiliency in the face of some of these climate challenges, which we'll describe here in just a little bit. But I think it's just important to set the stage here and talk about the opportunity that we have to increase the habitat value in Allouez Bay. And with that, I think I will pass the mic to Tom.
All right, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Kristen. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about an interspersion analysis that Audubon Great Lakes conducted recently with drone imagery. The photographs were from 2020, and basically the drone images were analyzed and digitized, so we could evaluate down to a really specific scale what areas are open water, what areas are emergent vegetation, what areas are floating vegetation. And you might be saying to yourself, well, you can usually kind of tell that on aerial imagery, and that's true, but you get an even more exact picture of that with drone imagery, and we were able to compare the aerial imagery with the drone imagery for this analysis. So this is kind of the foundation of our planning for some of the restoration work that Dave and I will be talking about in the second half of this talk. But this is Allouez Bay right here. This is that southeast corner of the bay. You just saw the whole bay in Dave's slides. This is that southeast corner where Dave was talking about the emergent marsh that currently exists and has a lot of potential for restoration. And the next slide that you can go to, Kristen, has a little bit of a zoom of what I'm going to be talking about here in the next few minutes. So this is the same map, just zoomed in a little bit. We're looking at Bear Creek here, and I'm going to be talking about something called Hemi Marsh. And a lot of you probably know what that is, but if you don't, it's a combination of open water and various heights and densities of emergent and aquatic vegetation. And that's a really important habitat characteristic for most of those target species that Dave mentioned. And if you look here in Bear Creek, the 2 points I want to illustrate are the green is the emergent vegetation. So you can see that, especially to the east of Bear Creek, it's almost a sea of green. So what that tells you is that's pretty much a mat of emergent vegetation. And yeah, there's some species of birds and other wildlife that'll use that, including some of the target species. You can find swamp sparrows and stuff like that. But that is not Hemi Marsh. Hemi Marsh is, it used to be a lot more present in Allouez Bay, but invasive species like cattail, like reed canary grass, which often form those monotypic beds of emergent vegetation that we're now seeing due to invasive and hybrid cattail are what causes that long streak of light green that you see to the east of Bear Creek. But like I said, if you look, there's kind of a little bit of a peninsula of land to the north of the Bear Creek mouth there, and you can see some little speckles of green intermixed with the blue there. And also in that little lobe to the east there, to the east of Bear Creek, there's an unnamed creek that comes out there, and we see some of that blue and green intermixed coverage there on the map, and that indicates that Hemi Marsh. Go ahead, Kristen. And so again, here's like some pictures to kind of visualize this. And again, to the left, you're seeing a picture there of a big sedge marsh, which is also an important habitat. That's great habitat to have. There's species that need that, like sedge wren, some of the rail species, swamp sparrows. That's basically what a lot of Allouez Bay looks like, but the big difference is instead of native sedge species or native grass species or even native cattail, we're dealing with large mats of hybrid and invasive cattail. That middle picture is what you're really shooting for when you're talking about Hemi Marsh. You can see there's some stands of tall vegetation there. There's some stands of aquatic vegetation, submergent vegetation that's just barely poking its way out of the water. And there's also patches of open water. So it's that mix of habitat that several of the bird species, which I'll get into in detail here in a second, really key in for habitat preferences. And then there's the deeper, more open water, which obviously we have a lot of in Allouez Bay. Since remember from Dave's map, a lot of this bay is currently open water, and that definitely serves as a place where some species can hunt, and that's valuable for those species. But again, in this project, what we're trying to restore more of is that kind of patchwork of various vegetation and open water that you see in the middle there. Go ahead, please. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple of our target species here. Dave mentioned all of them. I won't get into all of them in the interest of time, but just a couple of them. So the rail family is some of the targets: Virginia rail and then Sora. And why are they targets? Well, as Dave said, these species are really sensitive to habitat degradation. They need good coastal wetland quality habitat to do well in. So evaluating how these species are doing is a really good way to evaluate the health of the coastal wetland. And they're not doing real well. This Virginia rail you see here, pretty stark population decline there in just that 10-year period. And as you can see in that picture, you might be saying to yourself, that's not a marsh, that bird's on pavement. And that's another challenge to these species, is not just their breeding ground, but also their migration. These birds, like a lot of our warblers and other songbirds, have huge challenges during migration for stopover habitat. And this poor bird, as a lot of rails do, found itself in a parking lot because they accidentally perceive that as water as they're migrating during the night, and pavement can look similar to water. Go ahead. Pipebill Grieb, that's one of those birds that if you're familiar with them, they dive to hunt. So obviously a bird that needs some open water, but it needs to nest in stands of vegetation. So definitely one of those species that prefers that Hemi Marsh habitat because it needs all of the categories that make up the Hemi Marsh. Again, as you can see, just like in the Virginia rail, their population seems to be on a decreasing trend in the last 10 years. There's a little bit of a lip there at the end that starts going back up, so that's encouraging, but obviously that's a very small sample size, just a year or two there. So still a decreasing trend, and a significant decreasing trend, which is alarming for this species. Go ahead, please. So then the bitterns, as Dave mentioned, are also a target species. The American bittern, a little bit more of a sedge liking species, but they will nest in definitely rushes like bulrush, burreed, and even sometimes cattail. But you can see here, unlike the Virginia rail and Pipebill Grieb, there's actually a little bit more optimism for them in terms of their trend in the last decade here. they seem to be relatively stable. Again, this is just over the last 10 years, but definitely a little more encouraging than the other couple species. And one other thing I should mention about why we want to survey these birds, you may be familiar with the breeding bird survey that's run by USGS and the Christmas bird count. And those are common ways to evaluate bird species on a local and a national level. But usually in those surveys, you can't really get into a lot of the habitats that these species are in. So marsh birds often require more intense surveying, sometimes with a boat, as we do in this project, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's another reason that we want to be surveying these species, is because traditional surveys like the breeding bird survey just don't get you enough data to come up with population trends like you're seeing here. Go ahead, please. And so, yeah, we are working with NRI, who is conducting surveys in Allouez Bay and elsewhere in the St. Louis River estuary for these species. Basically, they go out during the appropriate times of year, late spring, early summer, where these species are most detectable. They record everything they're seeing and hearing, but it's targeted surveys for these species. So playing a call, trying to get them to call back, because again, they're really hard to find. So you need that call back to increase the probability of detection. And those are point counts. And like I said, they do them in a boat to get closer to the areas that we're interested in surveying than you would be able to just with boots on or even waders. And in addition to the point counts, they have audio recording units, and that's exciting too, because those can be installed and programmed, and they just record for you in whatever intervals you set them to. So I know this winter, Annie and Alexis and Steve and their crew have been working on listening to those audio recording units, because that's another really good way to get data on which target species of these might be out there. And you might be saying to yourself, how do they have all that time to listen to them? Well, now you're able to build finders with algorithms to look for specific signatures of acoustics. So that can actually get flagged in the software, and then their experts can listen to where it's flagged to look for detections of those species. So again, yeah, all this surveying is going into our restoration efforts as we look for exactly which areas we want to focus on, but also to establish a baseline before the restoration, which is really important, because then that'll be part of the way that we can see how and in what ways the restoration may or may not have worked the way we thought it would. So I'm going to hand it back to Dave for a little bit here. And yeah, you can go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. So I've got a couple of slides here, Tom, and then it's back to you. So hang tight. As we went through the climate adaptation menu, as we reviewed the strategy and approaches document that Kristen shared with us earlier, I think there's a link to that. Great document, by the way. We found that there was a great opportunity here to dig deeper into resiliency. So Kristen's team led us through a 2-day workshop, and I won't go into too many of the details, but it followed the approach of defining, assessing, evaluating, identifying, and monitoring. And we worked through that as a team. So that group of people that I showed, the organizations that I showed you at the beginning of my section earlier, we had a 2-day meeting with folks, and we worked through these ideas and really helped to, I would say, define our project objectives a little bit more specifically. So that was super helpful, and I appreciated that. as an outcome from that project. But we did identify some challenges and some considerations that we focused more of our effort on in terms of how we might design this project. Increasing storm surges, we know that there is the predicted increase in both the intensity and the frequency of storm surges. This causes disturbance to the vegetation, can damage habitat, can flood habitat, can dry out habitat when the water levels decline. Not only can it damage habitat, but it can also impact nesting birds. So these storm surges, we knew were going to be a potential challenge that we had to address. Certain parts of that Allouez Bay area, and I guess I should mention the map you're looking at is an aerial image from, I think, 2020 with the herding map overlay on top of it. So that gives it a little bit of context. I apologize for that. Rapid fluctuation in water levels also being a challenge. As Tom mentioned, the Hemi Marsh idea is where you've got sort of this interspersion of open water and emergent and aquatic vegetation in sort of a patchiness that's, roughly they say it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, but of course we're in a dynamic system and that's going to fluctuate. We want to try to create and do what we can to create the conditions that would allow for Hemi Marsh to be resilient to changes in water depth. And it should also be mentioned, I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but quite a bit of the emergent marsh vegetation in that complex is floating mat vegetation. So, it does float up and down naturally. Like I said, it's a dynamic system. But the idea of Hemi Marsh, where you're opening things up, could be affected by increased storm surge, water level activity. And then I've already mentioned the invasive species component of climate change and the efforts that have been ongoing in Allouez Bay. But those were three broad topics that stood out and helped to then drive the development of specific actions that we would take here. And all of these things kind of come together. If we move into the next slide, Kristen, sort of this idea of exposure. So you're looking at the map of Allouez Bay again, but what we're looking at now is something that's called the Relative Exposure Index. This was a model that was developed by John Lonspa at the US EPA. Many of you have probably seen this, utilizing LiDAR data and some other modeling techniques to identify areas of the emergent marsh vegetation that have more exposure to wind wave energy. And so we know that there is a considerable amount of wind wave energy, fetch, if you will, that is potentially impacting the existing footprint, the extent of that emergent marsh vegetation. And actually, that's a hypothesis that we've been working on. And the idea being that we need to think about ways that we can slow that energy, reduce that energy as it comes into context with that leading edge of the emergent marsh, and that may very well help us to not only help to protect some of the high quality habitats that are within this complex right now. We know that there are patches of very high quality marsh habitat, but then also perhaps allow for the expansion of that marsh into areas where it historically had occurred, but does not today. These all came together in what we've been working on more recently with this project, which is the scoping of the design. And so I'm going to pass it back to Tom. I know we're running short on time, so Tom, I'm going to pass it back to you, and you can tell us a little bit more about this phased approach that we are taking to restore marsh bird habitat.
Absolutely, thanks, Dave. So, as Dave said, yeah, right now we're working on the scoping, and within that, the phasing of our proposed restorations in Allouez Bay. And I won't get too much into it, but our plan right now is for phase 1 to be lighter touch, invasive species, cattail phragmites, reed canary control. When I say lighter touch, I'm talking about targeted herbicide treatments, also possibly lighter machine type treatments. Phase 2, reducing that exposure that Dave was just talking about by possibly constructing structures like peninsulas, small islands, to block more of that wave energy or at least slow it down. And why is that? Because we would want to protect any areas that we manage in phase 3 And that would be more to create those Hemi Marsh conditions. So if you're really into wetland restoration, you've probably heard the terms channeling, potholing, but that's basically breaking up that cattail mat in ways to produce that patchy habitat. And you can see in the slide here in blue, a lot of this was directly impacted by that climate change adaptation workshop and work that we did with NIAX with the adaptation menu. And I'll talk about that here in the next slide. And so this really did have a big immediate impact, because at first we were thinking of going in right away and trying to create that Hemi Marsh for the reasons I talked about earlier. But as we went through the adaptation menu, we realized this probably isn't a very good idea, because right now a lot of these areas are really exposed and prone to degrading if we do more intense restoration work in them. So maybe we should start with some other methods that aren't as vulnerable to if we get a big storm with a big northwest wind that would blow right into this area. And then we can work on setting the groundwork for protecting those areas that are currently in high exposure modeled areas. And we all came to agreement that we thought that was a really good way forward. And that was directly due to the climate adaptation menu. Go ahead. And then just a quick word on some of the surveying that will continue here before Kristen wraps it up. But Allouez Bay isn't the only place we're doing surveys. We're also doing surveys elsewhere in the St. Louis River estuary. So again, those are targeted at some of these species, but also other migratory bird species. Again, as a baseline, just like the Allouez Bay surveys. But we're hoping that we're going to have several more projects down the road. And I'm sure that we're going to be using the adaptation menu in those as well. So we look forward to that. And then go ahead for what I believe is my last slide. And yeah, we'll continue to monitor the bird population. Obviously, we'll want to do some post-restoration surveys to see how the restoration has been working compared to how we thought. Dave did a really good job talking about all the projects going on right now having to do with wild rice planting and monitoring, LSRI, Lake Superior Research Institute's work with high floristic quality area measuring and cattail mapping, which directly went into the scoping of our project. And then obviously we'll want to see how the health of the coastal marsh, including the interspersion, the invasive species, does that stay constant while we're doing restoration actions, all things considered, or are other variables possibly due to climate change introduced that change the system in ways that we haven't even planned on. And finally, there are other indicators that we're watching for that also indicate the health of the system. Black terns, which is a state endangered species in Wisconsin, used to have a breeding colony in Allouez Bay. They don't anymore, but that's definitely one of our pie in the sky goals, is to have habitat that's acceptable to them again. And then muskrats are really good ecosystem engineers and create Hemi Marsh habitat as well. So seeing an increase in muskrats is an indication that habitat might be getting more to that Hemi Marsh goal that we're looking for. So not totally all about the birds in terms of the wildlife monitoring that we want to do. So I'll hand it back to Kristen for the end here, and then we'll have some time for questions, hopefully.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks, Dave. It's really cool to hear more about that project. And I'm really jealous of your bird photos. I love this photo here. I've been looking at it the whole time, just like, oh, that is so cool. Just to wrap us up before we open it up for a few questions here, I hope throughout the presentation, you're kind of getting the idea that the menu is really meant to be a tool for having this deliberate conversation about climate change and deliberate consideration of climate challenges built into project planning. So it's not necessarily a whole new way of doing things or meant to change the direction of a project, but it's just one piece of the puzzle that hopefully helps make management more robust to climate changes that we're going to continue seeing into the future. And with that, I'll just mention that we're expecting to publish the final version of this menu in this spring, like probably around May, knock on wood. But in the meantime, you can go to this URL to find a draft of that menu. And with that, maybe Natalie can help us field any questions. And if we don't get to yours, then please do send us an email. We're happy to answer any via email.
Thanks for the invite, by the way. This is great.
Really happy you guys could make it.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen, Dave, and Tom. I do see two questions. So the first is, do you see any effects on Allouez Bay or elsewhere of PFAS or even chemical or oil seepage or spills?
Great question. I don't have a good answer to that off the top of my head. I've been focused largely on the restoration of the marsh, but certainly those are concerns. I have not personally witnessed that as I've been out in the marsh or on Wisconsin Point this past season.
Yeah, and Dave has a lot more experience out in the marsh than I do. From my limited trips there, I would agree with him, but yeah, no firsthand observations of it, but definitely something to have in our minds.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question is, do you expect muskrats to help maintain interspersion, or are they more attracted to habitat that already has good interspersion of emergent veg and open water?
So Dave can elaborate if he knows more about them than I do, but the way I see it, you can find muskrats in habitat that's not excellent for sure. But I think they do like some interspersion, and that's what gets them there. But then the reason that you want them present is because then they can really help you not only amplify it, but to sustain it. Obviously, their huts are made by chewing cattails and other large emergent wetland species. So if we have channels or little patches of open water and muskrats are present, it's probably more likely that things could stay that way than if they're not present. And over time, vegetation just has a way of filling itself back in.
Yeah, I would echo that and just say that I did observe muskrat activity this season. So they're there, the opportunity to enhance habitat, to make it more suitable for muskrat, which then helps to maintain the interspersion. So it's kind of this cyclical process. But I think we have a really great opportunity because they are there was activity out there this past year that I saw. So excited about that.
Great, thank you. Can an organization hire NIACs to help through to help with adaptation planning using one of the adaptation menus?
Yeah, a great question. I would say first step is always just to reach out to one of us at NIACs, and we can think of a way to hopefully best fit your need. As after the coastal menu is published, we're hoping to have a couple dedicated workshops and some ways for kind of self-guided uses of the menu. So we're hoping to come up with a variety of options for people to use it if they want to. But yeah, contacting me at the email below is usually the first step. So thanks for the question.
Great. Okay, we have one more, so I'm going to try to squeeze it in. And it's, did I understand correctly that part of the restoration project is through building islands for wave attenuation? If yes, how do you go about doing that?
That we have identified as part of the phased approach that Tom was talking about, with the desire to reduce some of that wind wave energy that is impacting the front leading edge of the existing wetland habitat. And yes, that can be achieved through the strategic placement of dredge material, for example, whether that is an island or a subsurface shoal. There's some hydrologic modeling that needs to go into that. And as we get into the design process, which is sort of this next year, we're going to be working on a very specific design for that. That will then help to guide how those structures are created. But yes, beneficial use of dredge material would be a great option for that.
Okay, great. Well, we are at time. Thank you again so much, Kristen, Dave, and Tom, for your wonderful presentation. For folks in the audience, just a reminder that you can sign up for notices by visiting the link that I'll put in the chat right now. And then the recording of this event will also be available at the Minnesota Sea Grant website when it is ready. And a note that we will be taking a break for February and March, but should be back in April. So hope everyone has a great next few months, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.